So I'd like to introduce Kent Familton to you. He has these wonderful 3 paintings before you, and turn the floor over to him to talk a bit about the work and how this came about and what his background is and what maybe led him to be an artist.
Hello? Ooh, that's loud. Wow. Hi. It's great to see everybody. Thanks for coming out on behalf of all of us, Eric, Chris, myself. So I don't really know where to start, but I guess I can say that these paintings are the result of just really, I mean, obviously a lot of work, a lot of trial and error, a lot of reworking, a lot of searching, and I'm really just trying to kind of learn something and see something that I haven't really seen before. They do sort of blossom from sketches, but I'm constantly sketching anyway, and sometimes it's just thinking, oh well, maybe this might make a good painting. I think I think I've yet to actually make a successful painting, at least by my estimations of what a successful painting is, from a sketch. And so quite often they really kind of take on their own, they just start to, they never wind up looking like the sketches. And I try, but they really don't. Again, I could sit here and talk for hours and hours about painting and life and vicissitudes of ABC, so I don't really know exactly how to kind of just dive into one of these. I mean, I could talk about different size, scales, and I'm not really sure.
Well, for instance, what led into this painting? Where did you start?
This painting started, this is a little bit of an older painting, maybe 2 years or so. And it started, this actually did start from a sketch that was much more messy. And I really was trying to, as with all of my pieces, I suppose, or my work, I'm really going to elicit some kind of a response, be it emotional, physical, something that will hopefully ask some questions, and not necessarily just how was it made, but maybe questions regarding something that that relates to something to the everyday. Quite often, I'll get some sort of an idea from literature, perhaps. I think so much really influences me that it's not one single thing, and it's one thing from something, a line from a Raymond Carver short story, perhaps, and I just keep reading that line over and over, and I'm like, oh my gosh. And so all of a sudden, that sort of transcends and turns into a painting. And I really love the medium. I love paint, acrylic, oil, of course, and all the concoctions between the two. And this one being a little bit smoother, perhaps. I guess I could say smoother. I really feel that the picture plane, as far as being cut off in this rectilinear or rectangle, is quite important, because while I do think that they are ever expanding, I also feel that there is this sense of that it does fit on the wall, and I'm somehow, they're always, at least for me, they're always grounded in landscape for some reason. This kind of architectonic thing that's happening, that it's sort of, I get asked a lot, and I'm not really trying to make a landscape painting, but I think it's just all these years of being a biped and, you know, I don't know, just somehow they're always still grounded, whereas one might argue with some other abstract paintings or non-representational paintings, they just go on forever. So again, just hope that helped.
That was one question. I'm sure there's others. Anyone like to ask Kent a question about the work?
I talked to you.
Hi, yes, how are you? Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. I particularly love this one.
Thank you.
This one, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Which I thought was still life to me.
Uh-huh.
But, and you said it wasn't necessarily. But I don't quite know why I like it, but I think it's something to do with what you were saying, that it's kind of expensive, but also it has the structure, and it's in its frame and all that sort of thing. But what I really wanted to ask was, you say that you sometimes start with sketches, but you're not able to stick to the sketch. So what happens? What's your process in between the sketch and?
I think with the sketch, when I see the sketch before me, I guess in my mind I'm thinking, well, this is what it is, therefore it needs to sort of look like what it is, and then it seems a little boring. Not that it is boring, and so there's a lot of people that probably work that way. I'm not saying that your way of working is boring. It just, for me, it doesn't seem quite as interesting, because just the scale up in itself, I mean, the scale, the size, and the malleability of the paint, it's just privileged, and it just affords something that the sketch doesn't. And so it's not only is it impossible to make it just like it, but then I mean, this painting, this actually took a very, very, very long time, this piece. I want to say years. I want to say years. I don't know if it was years, for sure a year. I'm sorry?
Do you consider what you do an underpainting?
I think from the very first second till the time that it's hanging on the wall, there's no underpainting, there's no overpainting. It's everything. Hopefully, everything sort of coalesces and that there is some sort of unity within it. I'm not really too interested in just this abject and sublime and the push and pull. I'm looking for some kind of continuity, but just a little bit of the grit is good. And that's why I feel that something like this, which is a lot more brushy and a lot more layered and took a lot longer to get to than something like this, which is pretty heavy considering how much paint it does have on it as well. But I guess to answer your question, sir, it's just that it really gets exciting when you're working and you're stepping back and week to week, day to day, day to night, and all of a sudden you've just kind of abandoned what you had in your sketchbook or on that napkin or the piece of paper or piece of tape or your hand. And then pretty soon, and I do work on multiple pieces at once, and that really helps, because all the pieces start to influence each other. So I'll take something from this and I'll apply it to this, and vice versa. So another thing about this piece, being that it's the biggest painting of mine in the show, is I always feel that a small painting, a good small painting on the wall will look big, and a good big painting on the wall will look small, right? And so scale's weird. Like, when you start to get into like 6-7 feet canvases, then you're kind of in this quagmire. Like, well, is it a big painting? Is it a small painting? I'm not sure, depending on where it's shown as well. But this painting feels small to me. I think that's a good thing. it feels small. Because for me, it's kind of a big painting, and it feels a little small. I maybe just in the scope of the show and the room and all the wonderful work next to it and across from it. So, thank you for your question.
Anyone else?
I like this one particularly, but I'm curious about the horizontal line.
Yes.
It's going to mountains and lakes and something.
The dreaded horizontal line. Not dreaded whatsoever. I jest. Actually, that line, it's almost, I don't want to call it a tool or a visual cue, but it is a way of reinforcing the composition and the sort of horizontalness of the painting. And maybe anyone who came and had a closer look, there is quite a bit of underpainting as well in these, intentional underpainting. In this case, some horizontal lines also, much harder edged than the one on top. So again, it's just a way for me to balance it out compositionally. I love composition. Of course, I'm trying to make something that works compositionally, but I'm also just a little bit reacting against it because I want it to be accessible. Hopefully it's accessible and digestible to everybody, but I hope that it does have some kind of, I think I mentioned in my little blurb online that failure was a big part of my work. Not setting out to fail, but just being okay with something and the success or failure of a piece. It's really within me. I can't control it once it's on the wall. Perhaps that answered your question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I have two questions. One about the color palette. The paintings are from different times, but they, to me, still have a similar color language. Is that intentional? And then maybe you could tell us how the large one, it has some more color in it than the other ones. Maybe you could talk about that. And then one other question.
Oh, that's 3.
I'm an architect, so I see a lot of space in your paintings. Do you see them spatially or more flat as a canvas?
Both. That's not a, so I don't have to answer your question, but to address the first question, absolutely the colors are intentional. Huge, as with probably everybody else, I'm very much into color and thinking about color combinations. I think if I had to split myself into 3 people, one of those persons would probably just copy like Albert squares forever. But yes, the colors are definitely intentional. They're all muted as well. They're all tinted. None of the colors are straight from the tube. They're all what I like to call my colors, my little recipes, and they're, as far as this one having a little more color, and this is not a flip answer whatsoever, but this one just needed a little more. I feel this one needed a little more color. It's quite possible that these had some other color as well, but it just got covered. And working on 7 or 8 paintings at once and just thinking, well, I like that there's this singularity about every single one, and every now and then, while they do appear to be 3 different paintings, and that I'm happy about, I think that there's enough of the hand, or I guess my hand in each one, that one could say, oh, well, this was done from the same person. And color, it's very charged. It's very charged, and I tend to gravitate toward simple color combinations, a little more earthy, not as as bombastic or bright or it's not. I'm not trying to use. I'm not using color as. It's just yeah. They're very intentional. I can't completely go into what they all mean because we'd be here forever, but they're definitely more on the intentional and earthy. And I believe, was this more spatially, is this more of a spatial painting or a flat painting? And I was saying both. I really think that it is both, and not that there's this illusionistic space happening, but that, like this woman asked about underpainting. So while there's no underpainting here, there's areas of foreground, background, which are constantly calling attention, and it's one person, half of seeing something here positive, and the other half dozen seeing something over here. So thank you.
Speaking of color, I love the rose color or the purple color, and just kind of sneaks in there.
Thanks.
Because it's a natural feeling. The feeling of your paintings have a very natural nature feeling. I think that the colors are gorgeous.
Thank you very much.
Anyone else?
So what's this saying to you emotionally now?
What's this saying to me emotionally?
Tonight, yeah.
Right this second? You know what? I've been with this painting so long. I mean, not so long, but I think it's almost the law of diminishing returns, and what it was saying, or what I was getting from it a few months ago. It's not that I'm not getting it now, but I guess maybe I can say, what are you getting?
I knew you'd say that. I get a great sense of kind of peace, but a sense that it's comfortable in its own skin, and it's I'm here, but I'm not pushing myself at you. I'm here, and I'm happy, and I'm peaceful, and I'm also I don't know what the word is, frisson. There's a kind of
Frisson?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I can't ask for much more than that. I mean, I consider myself pretty lucky that happened.
That did that to me.
Thank you.
I feel myself lucky too. Thank you.
Well, that seems like a great place to end it, right?
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much, Kent.
Thank you very much.
But I'm happy to introduce Christopher Miles to you, whose 3 sculptures are here, and we'll spend some time upstairs, and again, then descend downstairs for the monster piece in the main gallery.
Good.
It's all yours.
Okay. There. Okay. Well, hi. So there are these 3 pieces. I'll stand over here. 3 ceramic pieces upstairs. There's 1 large piece downstairs that's made of paper and acrylic. And maybe we can talk a little about these and then move down there. And I guess I'll try and get some of the obvious away, which is always about sort of what they're made of, and then talk a little bit about maybe what's behind them, what drives the work. And what I would say just in general to start is that the ceramic work that's represented here, the paper work that's represented downstairs, they're very different, but there's very similar drives behind them. They have a lot of things in common. These pieces they're high fire ceramic. For those of you, I'll try not to get too much into the geeky stuff, but for those of you who are so inclined, it's stoneware. It's a fairly basic stoneware. It's fired to sort of a cone 10 plus range, so it's a rather high. Multiple glaze firings. The glaze is 99% high fire as well. Occasionally there are little touch-ups that get done on the back end with lower fire. But that's the kind of technical, the jargonish stuff, and we'll leave it at that. I'd rather talk a little more about sort of where the work comes from, what drives it, and I guess I think the easiest way I could describe it would be to say that The work comes from multiple interests or sort of multiple itches that I'm looking to scratch in the studio, and those really have to do with different things. And so I might just sort of go through those. And at the most basic level, I would say one of those is about an ongoing interest, it's really kind of a lifelong interest in what I might call kind of materials and their capacities and limitations. And this is something it's just been with me since I was a kid. It's something that's about who I am and my upbringing. My father was an aspiring sculptor who became an architect, who became a potter, who became a ceramic engineer and glaze chemist. And so I think, and it is still that last one at approaching 83. And so a big part of just growing up with him, my identification with him, my activity with him, was about kind of fundamental questions of what that I sometimes describe as what can be made from what. Basic questions about what a material can do, what it can't do, what it can do easily, what you have to force it to do, and really having to do with any kind of material. And in the case of ceramic, which is a material I certainly grew up with and I've gravitated back to at times, I've gravitated back towards pretty heavily recently, there's real interest in what is its potential. What can you do out of a material that is plastic, that is highly adhesive to itself, that does certain things under certain kinds of conditions, that can stack up very easily, that's highly malleable, but at the same time it's highly subject to gravity and is heavily limited to gravity. And so how do you exploit that limitation? How do you work against that limitation? So there's that kind of concern. There's a big concern about sort of the conditions under which things are made, which relates to the previous concern, sort of how do you work around and with some of those capacities that the material has. So how do you set up studio conditions that facilitate the way that an end product comes about? And in the case of this work, how do you do things that are very sort of strategic and deliberate on the front end to set up a practice that can be fairly spontaneous in the making to deliver a concrete result on the back end? Another big part of the work for me is maybe we start to get into conversations that are more about dealing with form and space and how you relate to it and how you know it. And I think particularly with ceramic works, one of the difficulties is that we have a tendency, I think because of our relationship to ceramic objects and also historical ceramic artwork that we know around us, of tending to relate to it as things that have tops and bottoms and fronts and backs. Inevitably, you talk about almost anything that is made out of ceramic, and inevitably the conversation comes around to jugs and cups and vessels, pots that have bottoms that sit in a certain way, and that really has to do with practical needs of historical objects and also the practical limitations of making them. It's easier to stack up clay from the bottom to the top, right? And so we tend to get those results. And so something I'm very interested in the case of this work, and in the work in general, is how do you make an object that we relate to in a different kind of way and different ways as we move around the object. Something I'm very interested in is the potential of sculpture to deliver an experience that changes as we move around it, so that our relationship to an object that is concrete is nonetheless a relationship that maybe shifts a bit and is unstable. You know, it's I think one of the limitations often of sculpture is when it's reduced to an experience that is about one angle, one point of view. And so I'm very interested in making objects that reward people for taking the time of looking at it from down here and from up there, from craning your neck and from stooping down and from moving around it in space. And I'm interested in rewarding that. I'm also interested in a certain amount of frustration that comes with that kind of forces you into the present, because you're in the for me, one of the great, this is a fairly old school idea, but one of the great experiences that we have with sculpture fundamentally is that aspect of never really being able to know it, and yet being in the moment with it, having this thing that is totally present and concrete, and yet we stand on one side of it and we move to the other side of it, and all of a sudden it's a different thing, and we won't have the same experience twice of it. Only, we reduce it to that kind of thing when we photograph it, right, and we freeze it in an image. But I really want to make work that constantly keeps us moving around it, and I can talk a little bit about the working conditions that I try to bring about that encourage that. And then, I think the last thing that's really important is, when you deal with form, and when you deal with form that's very materially involved, and form that is relatively abstract or quasi-abstract, at what point does that begin to move into something that, if you will, sort of reads or that implies? At what point can an object begin to take on a kind of implication, attitude, association? And that's something that's of great interest to me. Some of the work that I've done before this has pushed a little more in an explicitly referential direction. I would say this work pulls away from that a little bit. But inevitably, for the same reason that we look at clouds and we see things, I think this work is designed to encourage that kind of activity, not in a vague kind of flaky way, but more in a bit of a focused and targeted way. And I'm very interested in the possibility that those attitudes, implications, associations can be somewhat conflicted, because that's who I am. I'm a person who's very interested in the possibility that something can be beautiful, lovely, delicate, refined, vulnerable, voluptuous, ugly, troublesome, compromised, brutal, and the possibility that those things can begin to fold into one object. I think that represents a certain kind of relationship that I have to myself, and I think it also has to do with a certain kind of relationship I have to the world, because I live in a world where I see how refined a place and a people can be, and also how brutal a place and a people can be, how human, how humorous, right? How vulnerable. I'm interested in how those things can begin to collapse in the associations that one might have with an object. So maybe that's enough. And I can talk a little bit about some of the technical stuff if people are curious.
There is one technical aspect.
Yeah.
I may be remembering this incorrectly, but
That's okay.
you were talking about the process of making these. And
Yeah.
was there a point where they're actually suspended?
Yeah.
Because that was really interesting.
This goes back to these interests about sort of working conditions and what kind of object can be produced out of them with the material. The natural way to start working with clay, as I said, is kind of start with the bottom and work up, right? And I'm not really interested in making objects that are built out of those kinds of circumstances. I mean, I might in other circumstances be, but in this case, no. And I wanted to, so one way to get to an object that doesn't in the end sort of deal in those circumstances is to try and build them in a different way. And so the piece that's downstairs, that's built on an armature that remains part of the work. These pieces are all built on armatures that are made so they can actually be disassembled from within the work and then removed, because they can't be fired into the work. And what that allows for is for these objects, now they sit here with gravity on a pedestal, but when they're being made, they're actually suspended in space. So I can work on them from every angle. I can get around a fair amount of the gravity that is a problem with clay, because that armature is providing support as they're being built, right? But then the armature becomes invisible because it's absent, it's gone. And so that's one way of, again, that's about creating sort of infrastructure and process on the front end, all of which goes away. So in the end, we get a product that is not as easily achieved with the material if you begin just with that table and a bunch of clay. So, yeah.
Do you think that's a good spot to maybe move downstairs
Sure.
and look at a totally different,
Okay.
but related process?
Okay, yeah, but I think there's
Okay,
a quick question
back
behind you.
here.
Yeah.
I was very impressed with all four of your pieces, because you just can't look at them visually from outward. You have to look inside the various holes and what have you.
Yes.
And that attracted me right away, because it's different.
Well, thank you. You're making me happy. And
One other question.
yeah.
How do you fire and glaze the stuff inside?
Well, the firing part is relatively simple. The firing part involves a lot of propping so that so they're in the, because this glaze gets pretty fluid in the firing, and I want the glaze to run in certain directions, and so it means that, so you're in this case, you're talking about objects that at first are sort of positionless in space as you're making them. They're suspended. Then once they're made, they kind of find a gravitational position. Then they need to be fired in that gravitational position because I want the glaze to flow in a way that echoes that, right? But firing them in the position, it's one thing once they're fired and sort of concrete for them to stand relatively easy. Firing them to a very high temperature where that clay starts to get a little wobbly and even soft at the higher temperatures, when it's only sitting on a few points, and there's a lot of weight in these, they're pretty chunky, that's tricky. So there's a lot of careful propping, and then those props the props are set with shims so that they kind of move with the piece as it shrinks, and those props all go away. As far as the glazing goes, there's multiple layers of glaze that get applied, removed, applied, removed, applied, removed. There's, in some cases, multiple glaze firing so that a first layer is fixed, and then more glaze, and then more firing. As far as getting the glaze throughout, part of building these is that, like I said, you get that initial infrastructure, but in the building process is fairly spontaneous. I want them to maintain that look, which means that some of the connections are pretty tenuous. In some cases, when these are initially dry but not yet glazed and fired, they clank and they clunk. So they're actually pieces that are kind of locked together but not even totally fused. They're loose. So the glazing achieves two issues. One aspect of the glazing is that it gives them the surface I want in and out. The other aspect of the glazing is it actually is ultimately the thing that totally fuses everything together and makes these, it's the glue on the back end, which is kind of a funny way to build something. And also because there's so much about looking in and everywhere, you can't kind of mess up and have that unglazed area. Every last nook and cranny, I want that glaze to be in there. So they're initially actually entirely bathed in glaze, and then subsequent layers, they're flooded basically, and then after that, additional layers get applied.
Thank you.
Yeah. Should we go downstairs?
Yeah, I think we should all filter
Okay.
downstairs and.
Okay.
All right, the floor is yours.
Okay, so this is an example of the paper work. And what I would say, I'll get the technical part just out of the way really quick. The way these, there is a relation in terms of the way that these are built in those pieces upstairs. One of the interests that's fairly common in the work is aside from, that very specific kind of technical issue of getting a form built in clay kind of off of that table. It's in general about dealing with forms suspended in space, and there's different ways that you can do that. In this case, the series of works that this really comes out of has to deal with these forms that they kind of stand up on these stilt-like legs in different ways, and these very simply, if we talk about how these go from beginning to end, these generally begin with a pretty loose idea in my head that go into sometimes into some very basic sketch. And when I say basic sketch, I'm not talking about working drawings. I'm talking about like the equivalent of the relationship between a gesture drawing and a finished figure drawing, okay? So if you imagine a kind of gesture drawing of a sculpture, which might just be a few sweeping lines that basically capture a certain kind of stance and positioning of weight and form, that might be the extent of a sketch, if there's any sketch at all for these. They go to building pretty fast, and the first stage is actually an aluminum skeleton that exists throughout the work, and the larger the work gets, the more extensive that skeleton has to become to hold it up. So this one has a pretty thorough skeleton running throughout the form that's buried underneath all that paper, and then incorporated into that skeleton is the support. And then once that skeleton is built, this goes back again to those kinds of working conditions. There's been a certain kind of commitment at that point to the framework that I'm building on. So the creation of the work from that point on can be relatively spontaneous, but at the same time, there's kind of a commitment to that skeleton. The musculature on top of that skeleton can only really vary so much. If I decide I want a third arm on my body, there's going to have to be some bones added to make that happen. We can't just do that by fleshing it out. And the same thing happens here. So the skeleton basically is built to realize that initial kind of gesture and form that I'm interested in. Then the fleshing out can work with a fair amount of liberty, but also with a fair amount of fidelity to that initial structure. And sometimes, okay, you kind of get to that point where you want to go back and change things, right? You want to add that third arm, so then that means that there's a kind of surgical process to go back and change that skeleton underneath in order to get back to this musculature that you're shifting. Everything that's built out on the surface is really, it's paper and acrylic paint. It's acrylic paint of a lot of different fancy word, we'll use a fancy word, viscosities, and paper of different thicknesses, different properties to achieve certain goals. And then it's about kind of working with the conditions, the potentials, and the limitations of the material. What can the paper do when it's drier? What can the paper do when it is wetter? What can the paper do when it's been totally soaked? And the paper gets built up. There's a lot of different layers of paint, but it's a kind of different version of a paper mache process that some of you know, and that I know a lot from when I was a kid, just building up paper with glue. In this case, the paper is pretty nice, and the glue is the paint itself, the acrylic polymer. So that's how they get built up. The underlying interests, very similar, really very much in line with the work upstairs, just taken towards different materials and different potentials. The paperwork really grew out of the ceramic work because there are certain similarities. The ceramic work is largely built out of cut slabs of clay that are planar initially, but then they can become very plastic. The paper is planar, but the difference is it's not a terribly plastic material. So we get into these differences. What can we achieve with a planar material similar to the planar material that I'm beginning with those ceramic slabs, but that is lighter, that is not plastic, right? But that achieves a certain kind of structural integrity that you can use towards ends that are much more difficult to handle in clay. This whole piece weighs about what 2 of those pieces upstairs weigh, right? And so then we also get into simple working conditions like, what can I do? Right? What can I achieve in a solitary practice making something? This is a piece that I can pick up and move from here to there. And to be able to do that with this larger work is, to do it at scale in the ceramic, we would be involving, cranes and lifts.
We found it's easier with 3 people.
It's easier with 3 people, but I actually can move it by myself. So this is the piece. And I would say, that associative range, I think, that I'm interested in with the works above, they apply just as much here. And I'm going to leave it at that and ask
Any questions for Chris?
So you're talking about setting up things before and after to kind of create this free space where you have a moment to kind of perform on the clay to make this thing that the piece is a history of your actions at that time, kind of frozen. Right? I'm curious about that. You put all this stuff aside and giving yourself this moment of just complete abstract freedom. Where are you mentally when you're doing that? When everything's been put away and you're making these violent marks? Are you listening to music? Or where? It seems like it may happen quickly.
Yeah.
What's happening at that moment?
I'm responding to the conditions that I've set up and the material I've got in front of me. I'm working towards certain general ends, and I would say that's where the control that sets in goes back to that range of associative potential, right? I'm interested in what we might call this kind of counterbalance of these different sort of aspects or attitudes to the work. I am very interested in the possibility that something can be, if we want to take 2 poles, and I don't think any of the works are intended to just have 2 poles, but if we want to choose 2, right? Maybe a pole between a certain kind of blunt brutality and something, and on the other end, a certain kind of articulate and delicate aspect of the work, right? am I achieving both of those? And so the initial conception of those working conditions is about creating the conditions that I think will result in making the work that can achieve those end goals, right? So once those conditions have been established, now I'm working towards achieving those goals. And I would say if I feel like if I'm not going to where I want to get, then I've got two variables I can change. One is how I'm acting, and one is the working conditions I set up. And I do go back and modify those in order to make it happen in the end. So I think maybe I kind of, okay? Okay.
What kind of paper did you use, and did you use acrylic clear medium to strengthen the paper?
Okay. All of the medium and paint is acrylic. There's nothing else. And the paper is really a variety of paper, but they're all cotton papers. And so it ranges from heavier papers of the kind that you would use for drawing or printmaking, right? Reeves Arches, that kind of type, to lighter weight drawing and sketch paper. And then I also use things like archival legal document paper, right? Just because they're different weights, they're different thicknesses, they're different stiffnesses. Some of them saturate more easily than others. So it's just choosing them for kind of each aspect of the work that's in play. And then as far as the paint, what a lot of it is actually a very, very thin, very fluid acrylic medium, though I use a variety of mediums. That's then basically, the paint is basically added to that as a kind of colorant. And so what that does is it allows for the paint to just be super liquid and fluid, again, for it to just kind of permeate everything that is being done. And the paint is applied to the paper sometimes before I start building, always as I'm building, and then quite a bit after the object is built. So there's just a lot of paint. And in the end, that application process, because it's highly fluid, when this was in the studio, it's a lot of volumes of material that you're dealing with. There are buckets set up to reclaim, kind of like if you're dealing with a dripping ceiling, because there's paint everywhere. So does that?
It's fantastic.
Anyone else?
Thank you.
You mentioned your father, sculptor,
Yeah.
architect, ceramicist, technician. How is your relationship with him influenced, guided you, not guided you, and how have you played off of that?
It's got to be a lot. And it's funny because my dad's 83, and he sees most of the work that I make, and he will walk up this and ask me the kind of mechanical material, technical questions that no one else, like while someone else is saying, "How'd you make that?" My dad's walking up to it and pointing to one area and saying, "So you used some pretty lightweight paper here with a very fluid extender, didn't you?" Because he has those same and totally with the ceramic work, right? Because he has a certain knowledge base, but he also just has those inclinations. We're both wired that same way, and I've been that way ever since I was a kid. And I'm sure, that's the result of what my father fostered and what I experienced with him. So that's a really big part of it. But I would say, the other aspect of this is schooling and other experience. On the flip side of this, I think when we begin to talk more about the kind of implicative aspects of the work, the associative aspects of the work, that really has to do. That's I didn't mean for this to be a biography, but in some ways it's a little more of the mother's side of the family, because my mom was an aspiring art historian. And so growing up with her, it was always about, what is the work, what is its context, what does it mean in that context, what are its implications given, right? So that's something that's on another part of my mind, and it was very much part of the conversation when I was going through my schooling. Very much part of the conversation when I was out of school and spending a number of years doing a lot of time writing about artwork. So a more kind of critical and analytical approach to work. So that's coming into play as well. And the work is the product of where those things meet.
Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you.
So it's my great pleasure to introduce Eric Yoner.
All right. You don't mind if I stand in the middle? So let me just give you a brief overview. If I had to, I know Ben Shahn once said something to the effect of if artists had to label themselves, there would be no labels. But if I had to label myself, it's probably in the category of smarty pants or something along those lines. But basically, smart art is what I've always been told I do. So in the end, I assume what they're also meaning is that I'm funny. And that's something that's always been a compliment to me. It's something that's most important for me in my work. And beyond that, hey, draftsmanship, it's like maybe I can compare it to like a baby teething or something like that, but like, a mathematician needs to solve problems or a spaceman needs to go to the moon or something. I need to draft, I need to draw. What can I tell you? This is what I do. And so it comes down to like law of attraction for certain things, right? So what do I pick out of the great wide world if like you can draw anything? You got to limit yourself. So I don't know what happens, but ultimately, in the case of this, I had this baseball mitt, and I'm like, I got to draw that mitt. Or in this case, I had this beautiful painting, this 17th century Baroque Flemish, Jacob Jordaens is what Americans maybe call him, but it's probably Jacob Jordaens or something like that. But we're all Americans here, so it doesn't matter. We're Jacob Jordaens. But it starts with that. So you got this baseball glove, and I'm going, man, I gotta find a good excuse to just draw that object. And so ultimately I find some intervention. I'm looking around, it's like a memory game, because I'm an archivist of images. I take in deadly serious things to funny things, it doesn't matter. Oftentimes, actually, I am a former journalism major, and, I watch a lot of deadly serious stuff, but then, you've got to put it through your machine, and it comes out in a way that hopefully makes people smile in the end. That's what I'm looking for, but I also want to be equally entertaining as enlightening, so that's for me. Maybe I'll drop that eventually and just be entertaining, but for the meantime, I also like to enlighten. So in this particular case, I found a use for the glove by just unstitching these, the middle part of it to make that sort of Vulcan salute. And, the way I saw it is, I know people who maybe are baseball enthusiasts want to like see into it, and maybe some statistical thing about like, why does you have a left-hander's glove or whatever the case may be, I don't know. But it has nothing to do with that. Ultimately, it has to do with this idea that here you have this extraterrestrial humanoid who ultimately is guided by logic and reason. And I just figured he'd take all the fun out of the game. Like, imagine him in the stands, right? Imagine him in the stands going like, well, I calculated where I'll catch the most foul balls. And this guy keeps reeling them in, and you're like, hey, what about one for the kids, There are actually people like this, and oftentimes they'll do it for charity, but they've calculated where they'll catch the most foul balls, and they're called ball hawks. So this is why I call it Vulcan leather, in the parentheses, ball hawk and prosper. But you can imagine him anywhere on the field, he'll have all the statistics down, and guaranteed if it's just a routine pop-up fly, he's probably gonna grab it in his web there. So that was the reason for that. Ultimately, if you look at these guys, what you're looking at is, I've worked a lot in graphite, charcoal, black and white for a long time. It's sort of a second nature thing to me. But the colored pencil is I like pointy objects within reason. But I was just taking colored pencils for a test drive, really, because it's kind of a new medium for me. I've used it for a little while, but not to this extent. And just a little plug for my show upcoming September 6th, Friday, September 6th at Ambach and Rice in LA. You'll see all brand new drawings, and a lot of them are me continuing that, putting the gas pedal on colored pencils. So, and I do sculpture and installation as well. So this is just one part of the environment that you see in a show. And most often, I'm not making things for just a one-off experience, but for an entire environment. So, you know, I use everything from like supermarket psychology, you know, like I want you to walk through my exhibition a certain way. And if you don't, it's okay, but that's how I've designed it. That's how I've set it up. And I'll be watching, so there's a hidden cam. But this piece, ultimately, Jacob, I took a look at his painting a long time ago, and I filed it away. And I think maybe even, you know, in parentheses, I put like, wow, must draw, or something like that. But it's a piece called The King Drinks. And in the center of this image, typically, well, you would see this old man sitting there kind of with, you know, tons of drink and food in front of him, and he's sitting there like laughing or guffawing or looking drunk. So there's a variety of these images. There's a lot of them out there. This one in particular just really hit me. And I figured I'd replace one king with another king. The idea is, in the Flemish tradition, I guess the Flems really like to party, but the 12th, I don't know, we call them Flems, right? Everybody, right? So the 12th night after Christmas, I mean, aren't we all just like done with the sales and all that stuff by then? These guys are really doing it, man. They said 12th night after Christmas is a little tradition they call the Epiphany, the Feast of the Epiphany. And what they do is ultimately they have a cake. Somebody makes a cake and puts one stinking bean in the cake, and it's a lottery. Whoever gets that bean gets to be king for the night. And, you know, it doesn't matter what your company is. For one night, you can change the societal hierarchy. You can lord over, hypothetically, a prince or a king yourself on one night, which in the end, I think sort of highlights just really where you are on the food chain. But nonetheless, the idea is after that, after you become king, you get to select your royal court. And I think in this case, I thought it was really apropos to use Michael Jackson replacing one king with another. And trust me, I put a lot of different people in this seat. A lot of different people, but ultimately, Michael Jackson was the way to go. A self-proclaimed king, I felt was better in this type of lottery system, where you get to, by random, be the king. So to some degree, here's a guy born to, depending on how you look at it, a tyrant or a disciplinarian, Joe Jackson in Gary, Indiana, who he may have had all the skills and the talent, but no one was gonna, like, you know, carry him onto this stage that essentially he lived with until the day he died. He never left it. And it's a prison of its own making, so it's kind of like, if you get that bean, if you're the one who gets that bean, is it actually an honor, or does it screw you for life? And maybe a little bit of both. And the idea is that most kings, of course, come through lineage or coup, depending on if you're watching what's happening in Egypt. But in this case, here, you see someone who's appointed themselves. Now, what will happen to the Jackson lineage? Will Blanket actually be the next king to come? It doesn't really work that way in society. So in a way, I mean, I could keep going on about what these particular images mean, but just know first, when it goes through my lens, it has to go through this. I picked the image, this particular painting without Michael, or this particular glove without Spock. I say, that's something I need to figure out something to do with in the future. And then what it becomes, hopefully, is the funniest and yet most poignant and poetic outcome. That's where I'm coming from with everything that I do. It's through that lens. So, yeah, if there's any questions. Thanks. Oh, yeah.
How about some questions for Eric? Anyone? Or did he sum it up so well that everyone's speechless?
If you were looking for the bearded rabbi in that brochure, that I swear he's still in here. It's once in a while I have these phantom thinking poses where I grab something that's not there. My mother, who's here tonight, she cried when she saw it was gone. So, not because it was bad, because she loved seeing my sweet face again. So, yeah.
Speaking of, I want to know a little bit about these braids on your shirt.
Oh, yeah, these braids on my shirt. You wouldn't believe. I've been weaving all day with my kneecaps. I swear, I tried the hardest avenue to do anything. No, I have no idea. It was, I think I bought it in Tijuana a long time ago. So somebody worked really hard on it, but not me, yeah.
Oh, good job anyway.
Oh, thank you so much.
Well, how long does it take to complete something that big?
Something like this, in this case, this particular drawing, although I used to do a lot of labor-intensive sculpture, so I had some things that took longer to do than this, but as far as drawings are concerned, this drawing took me longer to do than any drawing I had done previous. And I only gauge things by how long they stay on my wall because I do one thing at a time. It's the only way I can work. I've seen a lot more, women are better multitaskers, I know this for a fact. I, on the other hand, can only do one thing at a time. And here, in this case, 67 days this was on my wall. So, you know.
So when you're working like all day, every day?
I work, I'm at my studio 6 days a week, usually 11 a.m. to 9 at night, something like that. Yeah, and if I drew all that many hours, my hand would fall off. But I don't know, I could probably get in, 5 to 6 hours of drawing in a day. And then the rest is procrastination, and as long as there's not a hidden camera, I'll keep the rest private. Yeah. There's a question back there.
Yes, sir. Okay.
I don't know this painting, so is it a parody of it or an exact copy of it?
The
or an
painting, other than
approximation?
MJ,
Michael Jackson, yeah.
it is a direct likeness, but it's a different scale. This is a larger version, much larger. I haven't seen the piece in person, but obviously making it in colored pencils, I don't know, for some reason, I really love drawing paintings. There's something about that to me. I think it's because it already comes with a certain, well, it's my apprenticeship that I never got to have. What can I say? But then I get to use colored pencils instead of paintbrushes, which, I don't know, for me, it's always been sharp and pointy instead of the brush. It's just too messy. I don't know how, if you guys are painters in this room, I don't know how you do it. I've tried it, I hate it. So I respect, massive respect, yeah.
Anyone else for Eric? Well, thank you so much, Eric. That was a wonderful introduction to the work. And thank you, everyone, for coming. We'll have one last remaining art talk next Thursday, so please come by. It'll also be at 6:30 p.m. And if you would, please RSVP at the front desk before you leave if you do plan on joining us again, and please do. Thank you so much.